Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 480, Japanese Americans at War. Last time, post-Pearl Harbor America assumed the worst of its Japanese American citizens, with no proof. Yet with time and court cases, not in equal measure, those behind barbed wire would either be set free or allowed to join the armed forces. This benefited the nation more than it did those young Japanese Americans. But progress, by fair or foul means, is still progress. It would be nice to say that from FDR on down, American officials had realized their egregious mistake and wanted to make amends. But that would be inaccurate, to say the least. Speaking of the least, the U.S. Armed Forces realized they needed intelligence on the Japanese as their culture and, more specifically, their language. To be sure, the U.S. military realized the need for something like a language school even before Pearl Harbor was attacked, as strained relations between Washington and Tokyo called for a better understanding of Japanese thinking and its language. Hence, the first school was opened in November 1941 in San Francisco, just days before the attack. Of course, with the internment camps springing up, the school was moved in June 1942 to Camp Savage, Minnesota. From there, it would be moved again, but not too far, this time Fort Snelling in the same state. But anyone listening to this might be thinking, okay, the U.S. is working on clearing the stain of racism. Not so much. Though Japanese Americans served in almost every theater in the U.S. Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and in foreign assignments with other countries, what they were achieving was not made public. And it gets worse. When the World War II military intelligence documents were declassified in 1972, graduates of the Military Intelligence Service Language School, or MISLS, and their families were shocked to learn that the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, and many Army units did not keep records of the Nisei graduates attached to their respective units. Officially, they were on detached service to whatever unit to help with intelligence and language, whereas these young men thought they were a true member of whatever unit and were providing much-needed help. That's, of course, when they were not in combat. And considering that 6,000 of these young men would serve in the Pacific Theater and then in occupied Japan after the war, it was just another reminder of their second-class status. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, there were some 5,000 Nisei, that is, American-born but to Japanese parents, currently serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. Some of these young men had their weapons taken away from them and were placed in POW compounds, the guns of their comrades now turned on them. Many others were discharged and classified as 4C, enemy aliens not desired for the armed service. But before we go on, let's cover two young men who would prove their loyalty to their country. Before the war came to Hawaii or Europe, Japanese Americans were already being used for military intelligence. Two men, Arthur Komori and Richard Sakakida, both Hawaiian-born Nisei, were recruited in March 1941 and sent to the Philippines. The U.S. Corps of Intelligence Police wanted to know if the Japanese had agents there, stirring up trouble or, at the very least, gathering intelligence and recruiting. But soon, the war comes to Hawaii and the Philippines, and before too long, FDR orders MacArthur to leave Corregidor. The two agents, Arthur and Richard, are expected to leave as well, but Richard Sakakida requests to stay behind, so he can translate for General Jonathan Wainwright, who will remain behind and be in command. But soon, both men, and all them with them, have to surrender. As a Japanese American, and obviously working for the enemy, Japanese soldiers torture Sakakida and dislocate his shoulders. Next, he is placed in a camp in Manila where Filipino guerrillas are being held. Richard stayed there for almost a year. In February 1943, he was cleared by the Japanese Chief Judge Advocate of being a spy, and he made Richard a staff translator and his houseboy. As he was stationed in the Chief Judge Advocate's home, he saw military documents. One day, when alone at the house, a woman knocked on the door. She wanted to ask permission to visit her husband in the POW camp that Richard had been in. Taking a chance, Richard told her the truth about himself, and soon they had a system set up where he passed information to her, she to the Philippine Resistance, and then to MacArthur, now in Brisbane, Australia. But Richard Sakakida wasn't done. Knowing it was only a matter of time before this woman, his contact with the outside world, was caught, he came up with a plan to get her out of there with as many POWs as he could. And this plan was based on the fact that he looked Japanese, that he was Japanese. In October 1943, just months after giving MacArthur all the information he could, Sakakida got hold of a Japanese officer's uniform, and he led some of the Philippine guerrillas to the camp. The guerrillas overpowered the guards, while Richard had been distracting them. Almost 500 prisoners escaped that night, but not Richard. No, he took off the uniform and returned to the judge advocate's house, continuing with his duties. When Allied troops landed in the Philippines, Sakakida escaped and hid in the jungle for 2 months, and this with a wound from an artillery shell suffered as he was running away. Both Sakakida and Omori were awarded the Bronze Star for their service. Back to the Army Language School, its origin was humble, to say the least. The same survey that showed that U.S. Armed Forces personnel knew practically nothing of Japanese culture or the language also showed that of the 3,700 enlisted Nisei interviewed, only 3% of them were competent linguists. They were more American than the white Americans in not caring about another's language, which is not an insult. Given World War I and the Great Depression, Americans of all kinds were thinking of themselves, and had been for years. Still, this had to be rectified, so the War Department, though grumbling, put up $2,000 to start the first Army Japanese language school. It would be led by Lieutenant Colonel John Reckerling, who had graduated from a U.S. Army language course in Japan just after the Great War. It wasn't a school so much as just a program in a hangar. Classes started on November 1st, 1941, with 60 students and 4 Nisei instructors. The students were comprised of 58 Nisei and 2 Caucasians, but here comes the rub. All the enlistees were promised commissions if they completed the course, and only 45 of the 60 made it through. But the promise had been hollow. 10 of the 45 Nisei graduates stayed on as instructors, the rest were moved on to non-intelligence assignments. Again, the Nisei's loyalty to the United States and the very skills as linguists were doubted by Army field commanders, and that set the tone for everyone else. For example, 2 of the top students, even before their official graduation, were sent to the Pacific Theater. Finally, they would get a chance to show their love and loyalty, but it was not to be. One was assigned to drive a truck, the other became the driver of a general's jeep. This was the spring of 1942, but before too long, with the string of Japanese successes continuing, clearly intelligence was needed, so some of the other linguists were sent east. But as for being treated as a valuable asset, worthy of trust, that was still in the future. With the first graduation class away, it was time to expand, but the West Coast was still not happy about having Japanese Americans in their area, so the school was moved to Camp Savage near Minneapolis, Minnesota. Its new commander was Colonel Kai E. Rouseman. Rouseman was born in Denmark, but he struggled to find work. Then he came to the United States because he heard the wild rumor that Henry Ford was paying $5 a day. Unheard of. This plan didn't pan out for Rouseman, nor did the Navy or Marine Corps, but he was able to join the U.S. Army and was stationed in Hawaii, Corregidor, and Fort Monroe, Virginia, as a Japanese language student and then as assistant military attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. Having been a part of the language school in California, he was a good fit and geared the curriculum to emphasize military aspects of the language. They were desperately needed by all the Allied countries fighting in the Pacific Theater. But as far as trusting the Japanese Americans, not much had changed. First, several hundred recruits from detention camps volunteered to help the school, and by 1943, some of the Japanese American troops from the 442nd Regiment returned to help teach the classes. But it was the white graduates who were commissioned as second lieutenants. Most Nisei students were advanced just 1 or 2 grade levels in enlisted ranks. As for the Nisei instructors teaching the white students, they never rose above sergeants. Jumping ahead just for the moment, in August 1944, the school was moved to Fort Snelling, Minnesota. Now the student body was made up of draftees, or those enlisted from the detention camps, or, adding insult to injury, from the free zones of the United States outside the West Coast. Also, a Chinese language and Korean division were added. Again, moving ahead, when the Japanese surrendered on August 15, 1945, the school switched emphasis again, now, to civil affairs courses. Japan would be occupied, and communication with those occupied was more important than ever. I would like to end the story arc with some stories of how Japanese Americans served their country during the war and literally did what all others in the United States could not. Linguists Yutaka Namba and Kiyoshi Hirano were told by their boss, Captain Larry Dowd, in early 1944, that the Office of the Manhattan Project needed them. Of course, these 2 Americans said yes, but were only told as much as they needed to know, and did not discuss with each other what they did after they arrived in New York City. At first, they were asked to improve the Army's technical manual on Japanese military terminologies. Well, that could be connected to anything. But then they were asked to translate Japanese technical manuals confiscated from Japanese companies in New York when Pearl Harbor was attacked. The people in the United States working on the atomic bomb wanted to see how far the Japanese were getting on with their own version. Fortunately, partly through these translations, Washington was told Tokyo is not nearly as close as we are. As for female Japanese Americans, the WACS, or the Women's Army Corps, did not allow Japanese American women to join until September 1st, 1943. Those that signed up started their training at Fort Snelling in November 1944. In January 1946, some of these were sent to Japan to be Allied translators, but MacArthur's office had recently ordered no more enlisted WACs to serve overseas here. Hence, these women were given a choice: either go back to the United States and stay in the service, or be discharged and take up a 1-year contract as civilians in U.S. Federal Civil Service in Japan. These ladies did not appreciate the clearly sexist attitude coming from MacArthur's headquarters, but they took the deal to stay and work. Going back to the U.S. effort in the Pacific to push back the Japanese, the Battle of Guadalcanal, a titanic struggle, lasted just over 6 months and was America's foray into the Pacific War, and it was bloody. Some 7,000 Allied troops died, and another 7,000 were wounded. Located at the bottom of the Solomon Chain of Islands, America got a taste of what was going to be needed to take the fight to the enemy, and right alongside the American troops were graduates of the language school. At first, they fought, and then when prisoners started to be taken, these men like Takahashi Kubo and Takeo Kubo switched gears and interrogated the POWs. Information was gathered, and the Allied troops stuck it out. The Japanese would evacuate Guadalcanal in February 1943. But it would be during the Battle of Bougainville when the ability of the linguists would come to the fore and make a significant difference. Just above the island of Bougainville is the island of New Britain, and on it, in its top right corner, is the port city of Rabaul, Japan's greatest overseas bastion, which meant the Japanese would fight tooth and nail to safeguard Bougainville, thereby protecting New Britain and Rabaul. But as it was next in the Solomon Island chain, a U.S. Marine division landed on Bougainville on November 1st, 1943. And with them was linguist Herb Maruyama. 5 weeks later, more Marines would land and with them, a linguist team, including Roy Fuji, Tatsuo Matsuda, Manami Tahira, and others. The fighting was intense and deadly, but military prudence demanded that the Japanese launch a massive counterattack, literally to drive the enemy back into the sea. But during the fighting before this counterattack, the linguists were able to interrogate some POWs and put together a picture for their superiors. And when those pieces were brought together, the linguists figured out the counterattack's date, and it would be on March 23, 1944. But this was still 2 weeks away. The desperate Americans had never been given such an advantage when fighting the men of the Empire. Preparations were made. When the Japanese came, it turned into a slaughter for them. This Second Battle of Bougainville cost the Japanese 5,000 dead with another 3,000 wounded. This effectively ended combat action in the South Pacific. Two linguists, Hiroshi Matsuda and Roy Uyehata, were awarded the Bronze Stars for saving thousands of American lives. By the time the Battle of Bougainville was over, the Allies had lost some 1,200 men, Americans and Australian. The Japanese, on the other hand, lost somewhere between 18 and 21,000. Knowledge is power. During prolonged combat, the concept of time changes, as does one's perception. The Nisei linguists, Nisei again here means born in the United States, but to Japanese parents, were one of General MacArthur's greatest assets. But because of this, he decided to keep their contributions quiet during the war. The linguists' contributions were never in the press, and they were not to be interviewed as touching their particular contributions. For MacArthur, information, like knowing of the planned counterattack on Bougainville, also meant the general needed to know the enemy's weak points for exploitation. And these linguists, in order to get this information, stayed right next to the soldiers and Marines, and they all suffered alike in the jungle. They all contracted malaria, dengue fever, and jungle rot. But unless impossible, they had to stay with their unit. What they brought to the table was just too valuable to do without. Captured enemy diaries, combat orders, anything found was brought to these men, even in a hospital bed, to translate. Before 1944 was over, practically every white officer of U.S. forces cherished these men and learned to rely on their insights. That was quite a change from early 1942, when many of these men had been in detention camps. And now for a bit of irony. Allied soldiers during training were told of the Geneva Convention rules, namely that a captured enemy combatant was only required to give their name, rank, and serial number. For the Japanese warriors, it was different. Many were put into a position and expected to stay there until the war was over or they were killed. Surrender was unthinkable. To surrender was to shame oneself, their family, and the nation. Then again, they were purposefully not told of the Geneva rules. So, for the comparatively few that were captured versus those that died purposefully on the battlefield, they now found themselves in a confusing situation. For example, after leaving Corregidor, MacArthur made his way to Brisbane, Australia, his new headquarters. And soon there, too, was linguist Gary Kadani. And when the first Japanese POW was brought to Gary, he started talking to the POW. The enemy soldier immediately picked up on Gary's accent. He was clearly not a native Japanese. Now, this made a world of difference to the prisoner, who would never shame himself or his country by giving information to another Japanese who clearly worked for the enemy. But this was different. This was an American Japanese, hence no shame. And since the prisoner did not know he legally only had to give his name, rank, and serial number, he shared so much more than that. MacArthur was impressed, and that respect would only grow as eventually some 3,000 Nisei graduates worked in Brisbane during the war years, translating hundreds of thousands of documents and publishing millions of pages, all of Japanese intelligence. But there was more. Many Japanese soldiers kept detailed diaries, So if they were captured with their diary, it was turned over to a linguist who was able to get inside the head of the prisoner even before the first question was asked. The diary had entries of troop strength, valuable information to officers, but it also spoke of morale. No surprise, as the war went on, both troop strength and morale went down, which gave many linguists the idea of simply talking to these men and offering them coffee, food, cigarettes, and any other creature comfort that was to hand. And this made an impression on these young men who were only used to cruelty from their superiors. For all their training, normally accompanied by physical violence, simply talking to the POWs gave the interrogators an inroad into the psyches of these men. They felt listened to. Not to oversimplify it, but they normally shared more than was asked of them. As linguist Herbert Miyazaki of Merrill's Marauders once said, "Without feelings, you cannot interrogate." And now for a big one. With the Battle of Bougainville not going well for the Japanese, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, C&C of the Combined Fleet, planned on flying a plane there to visit the frontline troops. That would inspire them. Unfortunately for the Admiral, on April 14, 1943, a radio message was sent on ahead to prepare for his arrival, and this message was picked up by Nisei Harold Fudena at Port Moresby. To be fair, other linguists at Dutch Harbor, Alaska, and Hawaii heard it too, but Fudena got it to his superiors first. All of Allied-controlled Pacific in the know buzzed, as Yamamoto had been the one to conceive and make happen the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto lifted off from Rabaul on an unarmed Army bomber escorted by 6 Zeros. And though no records exist of this, supposedly FDR told Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, "Get Yamamoto," when he was informed of this intercepted and translated message. Problem was, Bougainville, the northernmost of the Solomon Islands, was at the extreme range of the U.S. P-38 fighters, and they would have to take off from Henderson Field at Guadalcanal on the southern end, which meant if the fighters were to be successful, they only had 15 minutes of flying time near the target, and those 6-0 fighters would certainly not make it easy. On the morning of April 18, 1943, though some of his staff begged him not to, Yamamoto's 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers left Rabaul, again escorted by 6 fighters. But when they were near the end of their flight, after some 315 miles or 507 kilometers, 16 P-38 fighters made contact. The Zeros fanned out to keep the P-38s away from the 2 bombers. Still, First Lieutenant Rex T. Barber got inside the defensive zone and fired on one of the transports. Rex was lucky, but unaware that he was firing on Yamamoto's plane. Actually, the P-38 pilots were not told who the VIP was, just that an important person would be exposed and thus had to be taken out. Rex kept on firing on the plane until it started smoking and going down. Only then did he switch to the second bomber. Yamamoto's bomber crash-landed in the jungle. It was found the next day by a Japanese search and rescue party. The body was searched. Found were 250 caliber bullet wounds. One bullet hit the back of his left shoulder. The other entered his lower jaw and exited above his right eye. MacArthur called this event one of the singularly most significant actions of the Pacific War. Jumping forward a bit, about halfway between Hawaii and New Guinea are the Marshall Islands. In early 1944, the U.S. had landed troops on the Marshall's largest atoll. The Japanese thinking was about this: the Marshall Islands would be used to attack and take next the Mariana Islands, almost 2,000 miles to the northwest of the Marshalls, even with Manila of the Philippines, and thus ever that much closer to the Japanese home islands. This the Japanese could not allow, so came up with Operation Z, an all-out counterattack. This attack would use practically everything the Japanese had in terms of naval forces in the area. But during the night of March 31, 1944, 2 Kawanishi H.A. Kate or Emily flying boats were caught in a typhoon. In one of these planes was Admiral Michi Koda, the man who succeeded Admiral Yamamoto, and in the other plane was his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Fukudome. Koga, Yamamoto's successor, did not survive, but the chief of staff did, and he had the battle plans of Operation Z on his person in a waterproof container. Fukudome and a few other survivors were picked up by Filipino fishermen and turned over to Filipino guerrillas. They, in turn, gave them to the American troops. The documents in the container, clearly important, were taken by sub to New Guinea and then flown to Brisbane. There, translators Yoshikazu Yamada and George Senki Yamashiro got to work. The document was translated and flown to Admiral Nimitz's headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Of this, the Japanese knew nothing, just assuming their men and planes had been lost in the storm. Yet it's worth noting that Koga's successor, Admiral Sumo Toyoda, rewrote the plans of Operation Z, committing even more planes to the counterattack, namely 450 carrier-based aircraft and at least 300 land-based aircraft. The Japanese would be coming with 3 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, with 69 support or escort vessels. The Americans, having the enemy's plans, came in with 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, and 120 escort vessels, all kinds. Like Yamamoto's dream of Pearl Harbor, delivering such a blow as to make the Americans come to the bargaining table, Admiral Toyoda felt the same way about his plans. Though called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in mid-June 1944, what would follow would be the largest carrier-to-carrier battle in history. Ironically, the Japanese will only lose 3 carriers, 2 fleet carriers, and 1 light carrier. But the reason this is the end of any large Japanese offensive for the rest of the war was the loss of at least 550 of their aircraft, and their best pilots were already dead by this point. The battle of attrition, feared by many Japanese military thinkers before the attack on Pearl, was coming true. Of course, the war was far from over, as was the contribution of the Nisei translators. They would contribute and participate in the taking of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, but they also contributed directly in saving the lives of Japanese civilians. As the fighting on Saipan wound down, which allowed the U.S. to bomb the enemy home islands directly, the linguists were kept busy. As Japanese propaganda had been extreme in regards to how the U.S. treated its prisoners, some 1,000 Japanese civilians killed themselves as the Americans approached, thinking the worst was about to happen to them. But when the fighting was over, it was found that Japanese soldiers and civilians were still hiding in caves, most times with the former holding the latter hostage. So Bob Hoichi Kubo used a rope to climb down into a cave that had about 100 hostages in it, women and children. Bob put down his pistol and shared his K-ration with the soldiers. During this meal, which they were grateful for, Bob talked the men into surrendering. What was the point? The war here, for them, was already over. The soldiers agreed, and the hostages were saved. Bob was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for this. This type of bravery also played out on Iwo Jima. The Allied troops and their linguists landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, the 3rd anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066. The Allies would go on to lose some 5,563 men, with another 17,343 wounded before the island was taken. But it could have been much worse. Corporal Terry Dowie, nicknamed Guts Dowie, volunteered to bring enemy combatants out of the caves. Taking only a knife and a flashlight, he stripped down to his pants to show that he had no gun. Guts Dowie went through cave after cave, talking to enemy soldiers and getting them, in small groups, to come out and surrender. He would be awarded the Silver Star for these actions. The Nisei translators, many from internment camps, would go on to help fight the war on Okinawa, in the China-Burma-India theater, and in Europe, as the British wanted Nisei help with messages from Japan to their ambassador in Berlin. And after Japan was occupied, the linguists had a whole other set of responsibilities, not to mention the war crimes trials. Many would continue to serve in the American military during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. But returning to the end of World War II, many of these young men and women had been imprisoned and had everything taken from them. Why? Because of their ancestry. Yet their knowledge of language from that ancestry was needed by the U.S. government. This gave those young people a chance to prove their love and loyalty to the very government and country that kept their families incarcerated as they put their lives on the line. May their patriotism and bravery forever be remembered. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So I just want to say hi to some new members and thank those who have donated. We're done with the internment camps, and now it's on to the Battle of Moscow when Stalin's about to launch his counteroffensive. So that's early December 1941, so we'll get to that next time. Anyways, let's see here. As far as new members, Mark Filippo from London, UK. Mark, I hope I got the last name right. If I didn't, don't tell me. Brad Morton from Rockdale, New South Wales, Australia. Thank you, Brad. We had a lovely conversation over email. All the best to you, Brad. Let's see here. Donations. Kevin O'Brien donated. Thank you very much, Kevin. And Duncan Murray of Pacific Grove, California, who is now my blood brother, as we both share the pain, financially, of having kids in college. Good luck with that, Duncan. Let's see here. And again, as I said earlier, and now on to the Battle of Moscow. Take care, everyone.